Breaking: Putin surrenders Russia to China. The Celestial Empire strikes with unprecedented force. Even cheap oil can't rescue the Kremlin now. Panic consumes Putin as his power collapses. Beijing silently sweeps across the Russian Far East while Moscow stands helpless. The dictator's grip crumbles before our eyes. Alarm bells ring from China as the capital trembles. The world watches in horror as Beijing takes control. Oil plunges to record lows. Russia teeters on the edge of chaos. Let's talk about it. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. Maria Farafonova here with the latest updates. Putin is handing over his country to China. The growing influence of Beijing is dangerous for Russia, so much so that even Soviet leaders avoided such deep dependence. By aligning so closely with China, Russia is effectively surrendering its sovereignty, leaving itself vulnerable to Beijing's control. This assessment comes from Lithuanian diplomat Žygimantas Paviljonis, head of United for Ukraine and deputy chair of the Lithuanian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee.
If we look at the current war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a high-tech, robotic conflict, the war of the future. Ukraine now operates with the EU's best technologies. All major powers are investing in Ukraine's industrial capacity. Meanwhile, Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China and other radical states, such as Iran, which is currently collapsing. I believe this trend will continue into the future.
He added that Russia's allies are failing. In Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, and perhaps even China could face challenges soon. Russia clings to the past while Ukraine is focused on the future.
Strategically, Ukraine is winning, in part due to sanctions on Russia. Sanctions may not have an immediate effect, but their long-term impact is significant. China's influence over Russia is dangerous for Russia itself. Even Soviet leaders avoided such cooperation. Now, Putin is handing his country over to China.
Furthermore, Russia is increasingly no longer seen as an independent state.
I recently spoke with Americans, and it's striking. When they look at Russian territory, they already see China, not Russia. In their minds, Russia has effectively disappeared. Even Belarus is seen as Chinese territory. Russia is surrendering its sovereignty to China, and Beijing will absorb it. Meanwhile, Ukraine will integrate with the EU and NATO.
Meanwhile, Beijing is already quietly expanding its reach over parts of Russia. Moscow's dependence on China keeps growing as massive resource projects in the Far East and Siberia transform these territories into a giant raw materials reservoir for the Middle Kingdom. It seems the Kremlin is congratulating itself while effectively handing over the keys. One striking example of this expansion is the Zashulanskaya coal depot in Transbaikalia, developed jointly by Russia's N+ Group and China's Shenhua Group. The mine is planned to operate for 100 years, and Russian authorities have provided generous tax incentives, effectively turning Siberia into a long-term resource base for Beijing. Beginning in 2027, approximately 5 million tons of coal a year are expected to flow to China, roughly 500 truckloads every day. A new transport corridor is being laid just 200 meters from residents' gardens, 1.6 kilometers from the Yamarovka mineral water spring, and directly through forests where rare plants grow. Environmental concerns appear to be secondary. Despite earlier assurances, locals say they have not received real employment opportunities. The key positions are being filled by Chinese specialists. Meanwhile, cedar forests are being cleared, and attempts to redirect the road away from protected territories are blocked by bureaucratic hurdles. Chinese influence is also expanding in tourism. In Russia's Irkutsk region, travel routes aimed at Chinese visitors are multiplying, while investors from China are purchasing land and building hotels along the shores of Lake Baikal, squeezing out local businesses. Some estimates suggest that up to 2 million Chinese citizens may already reside in the Russian Far East. Meanwhile, Russian oil discounts for China have hit the new high. Moscow is slashing prices to compensate for declining exports to India, according to Reuters. Price cuts followed US President Donald Trump's announcement of a trade deal with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which aims to halt Russian oil purchases, though the timeline remains vague. Analysts note that if India reduces its imports, China will effectively be Russia's only major buyer of cheap oil. At the same time, Western sanctions are suppressing demand, and oil stocks in floating storage continue to swell. Traders report that Aspo crude shipped from Kozmina to China is now discounted nearly $9 per barrel versus Brent, up from $7 to $8 in recent months. Urals crude exported from Baltic ports traditionally sent to India is discounted around $12 per barrel and could drop further. Emma Lee of Vertexa noted that Chinese buyers have been eagerly taking advantage of these deals in recent months.
Chinese buyers have been snapping up discounted Russian oil for months, even cutting Iranian imports to buy more Russian crude. With Indian demand likely shrinking, further discounts seem inevitable, and this behavior is expected to continue.
According to Lee, the main buyers of sanctioned oil are independent Chinese refineries known as teapots. In January, shipments to the Shandong province hub hit record levels, highlighting how Beijing quietly corners the market while Russia scrambles to sell. The United States is pushing China to cut purchases of Russian oil and increase imports of energy resources from the US. Washington believes that such a step could weaken Russia's economic position during the war against Ukraine. According to the Wall Street Journal, this issue may be raised ahead of the planned visit of US President Donald Trump to China. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is already considering including the issue of Russian oil on the agenda of upcoming negotiations. According to sources, Bessent has already discussed an initiative to persuade Beijing to reduce purchases of Russian oil and instead buy oil and gas products from the United States. Energy issues are also expected to be raised during Bessent's meeting with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. The talks are scheduled to take place in Paris in mid-March. During this meeting, the sides plan to agree on the framework for the future summit between Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which is currently scheduled for early April. The Wall Street Journal noted that reducing purchases of Russian oil would be a serious challenge for China. Beijing receives oil from Russia at a significant discount, making it more profitable than American supplies. American oil would become much more expensive, and abandoning Russian supplies would undermine Beijing's relations with the Kremlin and weaken Moscow's position in the war in Ukraine, the publication emphasized. In addition, according to sources, Bessent is considering appealing to China to reduce purchases of Iranian oil. The report notes that after strikes by the United States and Israel, a significant part of Iranian oil supplies has currently been halted. However, Washington wants Beijing to reduce its dependence on Iranian energy resources in the future if those supplies resume. Relations between Europe and the United States over the past year cannot be called simple, and in January, through Greenland, they went through another peak of crisis. And now a new turn. The administration of US President Donald Trump wants to divide Europe. The European Union's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, shocked with a statement. Will Europe actually be divided? And how will all this affect Ukraine? We will explain further in the report.
The administration of US President Donald Trump wants to divide Europe using tactics employed by the EU's adversaries. This was stated by the European Union's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, in an interview with the Financial Times. In my opinion, it's important for everyone to understand that the US has clearly shown it wants to divide Europe. They do not like the European Union. We have a very complex relationship. If you read the National Security Strategy and the US National Defense Strategy, I think there should be no illusions. Kallas is alluding to documents published by the Trump administration in December and January, in which the US criticized Europe. In the documents, the White House claimed that European governments censor free speech, block the end of Russia's war against Ukraine, and implement migration policies that will lead to the destruction of civilization.
The fact that European consolidation is indeed a problem, I think, is no secret to anyone, especially given the complex relationship with the United States. The United States, ever since the speech by Vance, the US Vice President in Munich in 2025, showed that overall they are quite negatively disposed toward the unity and agency of the European Union and have since been actively trying to support various centrifugal tendencies within the European Union.
Kallas noted that among the 27 EU countries, there are disagreements on how to handle the US. Our response should not be, oh, let's deal with Trump on a bilateral basis, but rather, let's deal with him together. They don't like it when we're together because then we become equals in strength. Callas admitted that Trump's position bolstered the arguments of France and other countries advocating for a more autonomous Europe, less dependent on the US, especially in defense. But she warned that steps taken too quickly could prove to be counterproductive. According to the EU's top diplomat, in the short term, there is room for both appeasing Trump and reducing dependence on the US. We need to buy from America because we lack the necessary assets, capabilities, or potential. At the same time, we also need to invest in our own defense industry. If we have agreed on the diagnosis, then we must also agree on the treatment. If we take these decisive steps, it will have a retaliatory effect, and it will be painful. But in the long run, in my opinion, we must be strong, because that is exactly what they also understand. Many EU countries, especially those bordering Russia, react sensitively to any initiatives that could increase tensions with Trump or accelerate a possible US withdrawal from the continent. According to EU officials, this makes it difficult to find a consensus on further actions.
Under these conditions, we see that the European Union faces several challenges at once. First, external pressure from the United States, which has traditionally been the European Union's main ally and partner, as well as the guarantor of European security, which is now being questioned as part of the US foreign policy review. An active threat from Russia, which does not hide its aggressive intentions towards European countries, as well as internal problems related to the strengthening of Eurosceptic forces, with a regular increase in support for various anti-European parties within the European Union itself.
Donald Trump applied tariffs and economic threats, considered the annexation of Greenland, and used Europe's dependence on Washington for defense security to force Brussels to comply. His MAGA movement has expanded support for far-right, populist and Eurosceptic parties on the continent. Trump supported Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán, the most pro-Kremlin and Eurosceptic leader in the EU, in his tense struggle for re-election next month.
It continues to be a rather loose confederation. And the situation with Orbán and several other countries shows that when it comes to making the most important decisions, there is always someone who will block those decisions. Therefore, the European Union finds itself unable to make the most important decisions. Everyone in the world sees this. And everyone sees that the European Union is not a subject but an object of geopolitics that can be pressured and forced into decisions. And they are doing this quite actively.
However, be that as it may, the main thing is that at the moment, Europeans are not refusing to help Ukraine. The promise of European Union leaders for a €90 billion loan to Ukraine will be fulfilled, even if Hungary blocks the first payments. This was stated by French President Emmanuel Macron.
The decision on the 90 billion loan is a decision we made together, given the unchanged military context. So we must fulfill the obligations we have undertaken and implement the decision made. This commitment will be fulfilled, and I say this here firmly and clearly.
While still at the Munich conference, Emmanuel Macron defined the issue of Ukraine and its support from the EU as existential for Europe. And this is truly important. Therefore, he is convinced that support for Ukraine will not decrease over time, which will mean that time will not play into Russia's hands. Macron insisted that in any peace settlement, Europe must play a direct role, a larger one than currently envisioned by US President Donald Trump. The new US defense strategy changes priorities in relations with Europe. Europe remains the main partner, but the US now expects European allies to take more responsibility for the continent's security, particularly in deterring Russia.
This is a rather serious question. Can the European Union be a subject? It can. But for this first, the issue of a unified European army must be resolved, which, in particular, Ukrainian President Zelensky has often spoken about lately. And here, of course, France can play a decisive role as the only nuclear power in the European Union. Next, consolidation of positions and development of decision-making mechanisms that would not allow individual politicians and individual countries to block these decisions.
Russia is described in the strategy as a serious but manageable threat that does not pose a fundamental danger to the United States in the near future. The United States is moving from unconditional support for Europe to a more limited one, which will depend on the contribution and involvement of European countries.
One can look for ways to bypass any destructive approaches of individual countries. That is, consensus should not prevent the making of the most important decisions. Therefore, it is necessary to change the approaches to making these decisions. It is necessary to return to the militarization of Europe, return to the energy independence of Europe. And these are the tasks that Europe faces. And at the same time, they do not have much time to make these decisions. Either they will become a subject now, or they will simply be torn apart by the same United States, Russia, and China.
Ukraine is preparing to assist its neighbors who are currently under Russian occupation. President Volodymyr Zelensky hinted at the possibility of operations aimed at destroying towers used to guide Shahed drones on the territory of Belarus. At the same time, there are reports of active efforts related to the situation in Transnistria. Here are the details.
Ukraine is trying to help its neighbors who are under Russian influence. Rumors are increasingly surfacing that Ukrainian troops could assist Moldova in deoccupying Transnistria.
They keep their military grouping there. Everything is fine for them there.
This could be more of a threat to us, and we can resolve this issue if we set our minds to it.
Resolve it radically. But is it necessary to do so?
This is where these geopolitical questions begin.
An enclave whose task is both the destabilization of the Republic of Moldova itself and the destabilization of Ukraine. It is already clear that if Russia fails to achieve a decisive victory in the war of attrition against Ukraine, Transnistria's days will be numbered. The self-proclaimed republic will cease to exist and will become an ordinary region of Moldova. And the Russian forces that are on foreign soil will be expelled from Moldova, just as they were expelled from other countries where they tried to plant their bloody roots.
And although Putin publicly speaks about Moldova with deliberate contempt, Russians are constantly trying to interfere in the country's politics and elections to install their candidates and gain full access to temporarily occupied Transnistria.
Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. Quite recently, it was the poorest country in Europe. Now, Ukraine has taken on this distinguished place of honor. For us, the presence of this country within the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, holds no particular value.
They need there to be, how should I put it, a demand here in Moldova, a political demand.
A political demand.
For a government that can come to an agreement with the Kremlin. What is this for?
This is so that the government would essentially turn a blind eye to the ongoing strengthening of the military presence in the Transnistrian region. Because if you turn a blind eye here, in 3 to 4 weeks, there will be 10,000
soldiers armed to the teeth. And then you can imagine what kind of tension that would create in the region.
And not only in the southwest of Ukraine, but also in the southeastern region of Romania.
Another country whose elections the Russians are already interfering in, Hungary. Russian political strategists are trying to promote the current Prime Minister Orban for re-election and are building the country's election campaign and policy on hatred towards Ukraine.
We do not want the Ukrainians to drag us into their war. We do not want Hungarians to go and die for Ukraine. We do not want our farmers to go bankrupt. We do not want Europe to turn into their mafia nest. We don't want Hungarian money to be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine is pursuing a very blatant anti-Hungarian policy, and the Ukrainians expect Brussels and their Hungarian proxies to put enough pressure on Hungary to take a position that serves Ukraine's interests. Hungary provides 30 to 40% of Ukraine's electricity imports, and in this sector, the Hungarian government can create difficulties for Ukraine. The Ukrainians had better remember this when they're at various planning tables deciding whether or not to bomb the Druzhba oil pipeline. So let that be on their minds.
President Zelensky has already threatened Orban to stop his sabotage because it's costing Ukrainian lives. Orban in turn made up a fake story about threats to his family.
It's just that the Russians are killing us, and we're supposed to give oil to Orban because, poor thing, he can't win the election without it. We hope that this individual in the European Union won't block the 90 billion, or the first tranche of the 90 billion. And Ukrainian soldiers will have weapons, otherwise we'll give this person's address to our armed forces, to our boys. Let them call him and speak to him in their own language.
The Ukrainians are already threatening my family, my children, and my grandchildren. Everyone is fine, but there's a limit to everything. At a time like this, my family gathers together. I ask them to take it seriously, but not to be afraid. Even though this isn't normal for our everyday lives, we'll figure out how to adapt to this. As we can see, Orban isn't particularly bothered by this. He's not bothered, if only because in an election campaign any means will do, including declaring a neighboring country an enemy based solely on the fact that it doesn't want to allow the financing of a war against itself. One can hope, of course, that once the election campaign is over, the Hungarian Prime Minister will be much more cautious in his statements and will no longer demand that Ukraine agree with all his political visions for the future, including his views on ties with Moscow.
After the deployment of the Oreshnik on Belarusian territory and assistance in coordinating Shahed strikes on Ukraine, President Zelensky also threatened the self-proclaimed Lukashenko with consequences for being dragged into the war.
It's really just Lukashenko's fantasy, his belief that he'll actually be helped if he continues to get dragged into this war. Moreover, we're not in the first year of the war, and it's already a technological war. We don't use our drones against Belarus
Because we're not at war with them. I emphasize that once again.
We're not in the first year of war, and we don't need to worry about manpower and our troops. We can manage many things right from the territory of Kiev. So he needs to come to his senses, as they say, sober up and not get dragged into the war.
And after the president of Ukraine imposed sanctions against Lukashenko and met with the Belarusian opposition, the dictator almost became hysterical.
How can we push some garbage, through journalists or whoever, to the people that everything you see would be fine? But these sanctions, Ukraine is in our way. Well, if anyone buys that, it's unlikely to be the Belarusians anymore. Belarusians are pragmatic people. You feed me first, and then you can tell me whatever. Clothe me?
But if we understand that the Belarusians themselves are not at all supporters of the political choice that Lukashenko made for them by usurping power, then indeed pressure on both Moscow and Minsk can lead sooner or later to a regime change. Or at least to the point where Putin will not be able or willing to provide Lukashenko with assistance in the event of new protest movements in Belarus. Well, in the end, Putin has already failed to help either Bashar al-Assad or Nicolas Maduro.
Russia is weakening every day, and this is felt primarily by those countries where Russian troops or Kremlin money have managed to infiltrate. And perhaps very soon the peoples of these countries will be able to reclaim what is rightfully theirs.
What do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video and subscribe to stay informed about the main headlines. See you soon!